Hey, welcome to Reflections on Gaming, a weekly look at gaming and how it influences pop culture at large. We're taking a break this week from our regularly scheduled podcasts in light of some recent events and a long-standing trend to bring you this special edition of Reflections on Gaming that we're calling Reality Check. I'm Westin.
And I'm Jordan. So, this week, Nintendo had another kind of press conference round of news coming out where they announced some things that people aren't particularly enamored with. And in light of that, and just some things that we've talked about in the past and just personal feelings, we want to get into a little bit about Nintendo and try to give people kind of a good perspective on the company, because we feel that of all the game developers and of all the production companies that revolve around gaming, Nintendo tends to be seen as this white knight entity that can do no wrong, and when it does do wrong, it fixes it, super quickly, and it's just, people look at it like it's some kind of amazing entity that cares about its customers rather than making money. And that's just not true. That's never true. A company's first goal and generally only goal is always to make money, because if you don't make money, you can't progress, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, the way that certain companies attempt to monetize and some of the issues that they are managed to get away with should not be just kind of swept under the rug. There's certain things that companies do that Nintendo has done that are unacceptable. And so we want to shine a light on the good, the bad, and what we consider the terrible that Nintendo has done in the past, and kind of where we feel like it's going right now, as well as some personal feelings that, are our own. And if you disagree, it's perfectly fine. Go ahead and send an email to reflectionsongaming@gmail.com and tell us what you think after all is said and done.
Yeah, we don't want to give the impression that we hate Nintendo completely and we hate everything they've ever done, and we'll continue to hate them and don't support any of the things that they've done. Like Jordan said, we want to shine a light on everything that they've done, because there are a lot of good things that have come from Nintendo. But especially when looking at the recent past, we have personally noticed a trend, and we want to talk about, where Nintendo has come from with its business practices, where it is now, and kind of where we see it going in the future as well.
Right, so let's start with one of the first kind of big things that Nintendo did that is a very positive thing, and we'll kind of go from there to the present. Nintendo actually kind of created the culture of gaming that we have right now. Not entirely on its own, but it did kickstart it entirely on its own. In the 1980s, there was a ton of video games coming out through arcade cabinets, and they were starting to get a number of home consoles, but all the home consoles had awful games on them. There were not really any contenders for being worthy of shelling out the amount of money that they were asking for, which at the time with inflation was over $1,000 sometimes for the systems, and then $120 with inflation for the games. And these were awful games like what's the famous one, the one with that stupid alien, I forget it right now.
Oh, E.T.
E.T., that's it. I kept thinking EA, and I'm like, no, that's not it. E.T., which was part of what caused the huge video game crash, because thousands of those cartridges were produced and never sold because people caught on real quick that the game sucked. But Nintendo decided to bet that people were still interested in video games, so it created a more powerful, more cost-effective system with games that people would actually really enjoy playing. And that was, of course, the Nintendo Entertainment System. And the Mario Brothers games that came out on it were kind of the first time people had seen anything like that. It was the original platforming game. And that and Nintendo's continued efforts to make money in that market really kickstarted, all the other companies that are like, hey, this is a viable thing that we can do. And so Sega came out with their system as a competitor. There was, I think, more Atari systems that continued coming out after the initial sales started taking off again. And then directly because of Nintendo's planned projects and failures, we got the PlayStation system. So Nintendo is essentially the father of modern gaming as we know it. And, that is a fantastic thing for anyone who likes playing video games.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you consider before the Nintendo Entertainment System or the NES, there were a couple that still get talked about a little bit, like the Nintendo Family Computer, the original Atari, the original Sega, the Commodore 64. But to be honest, none of those systems other than the NES have any games that really hold up today. But even now, today, 35 years after the release of the NES, there are still games that you can go back and play. And, the depth obviously isn't there. The graphics aren't there, but they aren't like unplayable. They are playable, and you can find fun in basically what started, the era of good home consoles way back in 1985. So it is really incredible how much it lent to the industry at the time and how much can trace the legacy of video games today in 2020 all the way back to that console, the NES, in 1985.
Right, and Nintendo has continued to not only push the medium forward, but innovate on the medium in ways that many other companies and producers have failed to do. A great look at that is after the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, we got the Nintendo 64. And the Nintendo 64, while not the first system to allow for 3D graphics rendering, it was the first one that could widely allow for 3D games. And because of that, and of course because of competition with Sony also having a system that could render 3D graphics, there was a lot of companies that tried to port some of their games, some of their intellectual properties from the 2D into the 3D world. And if you've ever played many games on the N64, such as Earthworm Jim 3D or the Bubsy game in 3D, whatever that was so terrible that it hardly warrants mention. There's a good number of games that tried to transition and failed.
Superman 64. Can't leave that one out.
Superman 64, awful game in every way, shape, and form. But Nintendo managed to take their iconic mascot of Mario and completely change up the formula. The only similarities between the previous Mario games and the new Super Mario 64 was that he jumped and it had similar characters. That's it. Everything else, the 3D world, the way you can jump, the introduction of the triple jump, the fact that Mario could kick and leap and long jump, and all of these things were new. And ask anyone who's played Mario 64, and they'll tell you that it's a fantastic game that is still fun today. And not only is it fun today, but it's got hundreds of people that speedrun it, that break it in ways that you never thought possible, and it is still relevant today in the current gaming sphere, which you can't say of a lot of games that came out even 5 years ago, a lot of games just fall off the map. But Nintendo created something that was so powerful, it changed the way people thought of how you could use an intellectual property.
Yeah, if there's ever any doubt about the impact of the N64 and the games on it, all you have to do is go look at any top 25, top 50 games, and probably somewhere in the top 10 you're going to find The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, and sometimes GoldenEye 007, which were all for the N64. The impact that those games have had on people who both grew up with it and played it well after they had come out. Obviously the fervor regarding things like Ocarina of Time has died down a little bit over the last few years. But they're not going to be, they're still going to be talked about for years and years and years to come about how they define 3D gaming as we know it today.
Right, and not only did they define 3D gaming at the time, they still are looked at for inspiration for games that come out more recently. I remember when the Darksiders franchise came out, the first one in the series, everyone was comparing it to The Legend of Zelda, and they're like, oh, this is like a dark, gritty Legend of Zelda mixed with Devil May Cry or God of War. And, they're not entirely wrong. And that's because the formula and the methodology behind those games is a great idea. There's nothing that you can complain about in the ideas behind it. You might complain nowadays about some of the execution, the wonky cameras, the terrible controller that led to, not being able to play the game quite the way that you'd like to, and things like that. But the core premise still stands up today. Now, not only did it manage to innovate in the 3D sphere, it also managed to innovate in the console technology. Not necessarily pushing anything forward in terms of graphics, memory, speed, or anything like that, but Nintendo was the first to enter the sphere of what's it called? Motion controls for games. And while their first endeavor sucked, the Power Glove did not work, their second endeavor with the Wii system did work, and it worked so well that it got millions of people that were not interested in video games to buy a console and play it. Even to this day, there are centers for assisted living homes for the elderly that have Wii consoles in them because it's a great way for people with certain dispositions to get exercise. And not only that, but it's something that they want to do. And I don't know if you've ever been to an assisted living facility or an old folks home or anything like that, but a lot of times it's very difficult to motivate them to do things that are good for them. So having something that they actively want to do is fantastic. And Nintendo was the company that pushed that forward.
Yeah, the Wii was really revolutionary, and so much so that, correct me if I'm wrong, but despite the fact that the PlayStation Move was also a thing, and the Kinect, was pretty popular in its heyday, the only thing that has matched the popularity and kind of like how much it's been talked about in the industry since the Wii has been VR. Things like the Oculus Rift and the the Vive, I don't remember. I don't know.
HTC Vive, yeah.
Yeah, the Vive. Like Nintendo just owned that for such a long time. They just owned motion controls. And other people had their own thing, but when motion controls came up, it was the Wii that really took the spotlight and was talked about, and it's what, a lot of people owned, and it was the most fun to play with out of all of them.
Right. So, as you can see, there's a good reason that Nintendo has been held in kind of such high regard. And as we discuss it, and as we start moving on to some of the negatives of the company, we don't want to take away from those positives and those good aspects. We just want to make sure that everyone is taking the entire picture and not just taking the good and ignoring the bad, because as we'll again discuss a little bit later, that does a disservice to the customers and it does a disservice to the company, because if you refuse to look at the negative aspects of a company, then you refuse to force them to address it, and they fail to learn and grow from it. But before we start getting negative, we want to continue talking about positive, in that Nintendo created the Wii U system, which they did terrible in marketing, but as a company, they managed to recover from it fairly well, because some of the higher ups in the company decided to take a pay cut to allow for their employees to continue working even though they were in a slump. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but the fact that someone was willing to, cut down how much money they made to allow their employees to not be put out is fantastic, because even recently, especially recently, with a lot of companies starting to go under and failing and losing their profits due to the current world events, a lot of people have been laid off. A lot of people have lost things that they were owed because higher ups in companies decided, you know what, screw them. I don't care. I'm going to keep the money that I have. So, fantastic thing that Nintendo decided to take that, some of those people decided to take that pay cut in order to not screw over their employees.
Yeah, things like that are super important. Like you said, just with everything going on right now. But moving on from the Wii U, the next big step. Well, there's a couple things. A little bit before the Wii U, or around the same time as the Wii U, the 3DS also came out, which was, just capitalize on a lot of their handheld systems that we haven't really talked about. But their handheld systems also, for most of video game history, they have been the handheld company. Every handheld, and especially every handheld that actually sold well, was made by Nintendo. And the 3DS kind of, sold really well, had kind of an interesting concept. But the next big thing that they really did was the Nintendo Switch, which kind of merged their two main foci, their home consoles and their handhelds were then merged into the Switch. One console that you could either plug into its dock at home, play on the TV, great for local multiplayer, and you could also hook the controllers into the screen and take it wherever you went, so it was also acted as a handheld that could play AAA full-fledged titles like Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And it sold like hotcakes. It still sells, it's still very, very high grossing. Most people consider the Switch to be Nintendo's best console that they've ever released because of its versatility and because of the number of really, really great AAA titles that have released onto it.
Yeah, the Nintendo Switch, I think, is the perfect system to highlight the highs and lows of Nintendo as a company, because while it's fantastic that they are merging their mobile or quote-unquote mobile games together with their home console games, part of that is due to just the market shifting. People are less interested in buying handheld game consoles. People don't want to have to buy an entirely new console just to be able to play their games. Several companies have looked to address this by having remote play through your mobile phones or through other handhelds or whatever, so that you can get that full console experience. But Nintendo decided to say, you know what, we'll just push the two together and make it so that everything comes out on the same system. That's great, but there are some major caveats to that. The first major caveat is that while Nintendo has been pushing very hard to get third-party software onto their system, those third-party software titles are always at a reduced and sometimes compromised quality as compared to any other location where you can buy them. This generally doesn't happen with smaller independent titles, or even, kind of the AA or B tier sphere of games. But in the AAA world, there's a lot of games that while you can play them, they don't play nearly as well as on other consoles or on computer. Now, if you don't mind the downgrades, then there's nothing wrong with that. And personally, I am of the opinion that graphics aren't everything, and 30 frames per second is perfectly competent to play a game without any issues. But the fact that the Switch hasn't really pushed anything forward in the console sphere is a little... It's not great for Nintendo right now. Obviously, they've got the whole you can take it anywhere, and that's fantastic. But in the end, this is less of a home console that you can take with you and more of a beefy mobile console that can play home console games. And that distinction, I think, is fairly important.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that I'll mention right now, negatively, is that Nintendo for the last several console generations has, pretty consistently been behind on the hardware aspect of it. Every new generation, like right now, the Switch is still selling and they're still developing for the Switch. They haven't announced a new console, but the PS5 and the new Xbox are
Xbox Series X.
Oh, Series X. Yeah, I can't keep that. I can't keep all the Xbox names straight. With the Xbox Series X being announced, you see the hardware in the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, and it just blows the Switch out of the water, which is fine. The Switch is not part of that generation, but even when even with the Switch coming out and the PS4 and the Xbox One X having been out, it still failed compared, hardware. When considering hardware, it was significantly less powerful than those. And Nintendo has always struggled with that. The Wii U and the Wii and the GameCube were all less powerful than their counterparts in that generation from Sony and Microsoft. Which again, yeah, if you don't really care about that kind of stuff, then okay, but it does show that trend, like you were saying, of not really pushing the industry forward and kind of setting their sights on other things, which I think we'll talk about more in a minute.
Right, and the thing that I want to be clear on is that not being graphically capable isn't a huge problem in terms of quality, because you're gonna get what you pay for. People can review things, you can see the comparison. So if you're fine with something that looks slightly worse, more power to you. The issue is that the Nintendo Switch is currently struggling to keep up with the current generation of consoles, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. With this new jump in technology, it is almost guaranteed that any game that comes out for those systems and for PC that's trying to keep up with that will not be able to run on the Switch. And it's just because the technology that's going to run them can't be pared down to allow for it to run on the Nintendo Switch, especially with Sony trying to change the console generation from just a pure graphical leap to really changing the way that the console runs and allows for games to be played on them. And this is, again, back to the Nintendo used to create consoles and they would try to change how you played games rather than just pushing for graphical fidelity. The GameCube had the mini discs, and it had the ability to attach that undercart system so that you could play both your Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games on it. And that's very innovative because no other system has ever had that. The Wii came out, it was all motion controls. And they eventually came out with a classic controller to allow for, some better controls over certain games, or at least different controls. But the mainstay of that console was motion controls. The Wii U came out, still had compatibility with the motion controls, also had its own dedicated Pro controllers for more contemporary titles, and it had one of the most innovative and one of my favorite aspects of the Wii U was having 2 screens. Now, unfortunately, the Wii U failed, so those dual screens were never utilized really to any great effect. But if you just imagine having all of those HUD displays and icons removed from the game and put onto this little screen in your hand that you could just refer to whenever you want, just how much better games could look and could function. And we lost that. And so when you go to the Switch and it's like, oh, cool, I can take this with me. Well, that's not really all that impressive because we've had mobile consoles for years, starting with the Game Boy, and then the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance SP, DS, DXXL, 3DS, 3DS XL, 2DS, 2DS XL, just, all these things. We've always had that. And now this is kind of bridging the gap, but it's not really changing anything. The only other big thing that they have is the IR sensor, which hasn't been used for anything except for Labo, and Labo is almost exclusively for children. I mean, if you like Labo, that's fantastic, but there's no real substance there, right? There's no big games, there's no killer app, there's nothing that's going to draw people to Labo outside of maybe makers for some of the tech behind it, or people with children that they want to build it with them to have a good time. I mean, you might like it for yourself for that, but still, it's not moving the industry forward. It is a one-off thing that's not really doing anything. The only other thing they have is the HD Rumble, which is nice, but it's not changing anything other than now certain things feel better. Going back to the Wii U on the gamepad actually had a specific type of audio technology that allowed, as long as you were positioning it in the right way, to make it sound like you had 3D audio, even though you only had 2 speakers. And if you have never experienced this, let me tell you, it is mind-blowing. Like, I swear, I hear people talking like from behind me on this thing, and it's just got regular speakers on it. It's the trippiest feeling I've ever had in terms of audio. And the Switch doesn't have that. So, we can see that Nintendo has kind of changed what it's trying to do in the industry. And while there's a lot of people that still claim they're trying to innovate, they're not really trying to innovate with their systems anymore. The fact that they're combining their mobile and home consoles together and allowing you to take it on the go is more indicative of recognizing that their mobile game sales far outnumbered their home console sales. So taking their mobile console and making it bigger and better so that you can play more quote unquote, home console titles on it is what they've done. They have gotten rid of their home console, not their mobile console. Their mobile console is now the focus, and I think unless they come out with a significantly more powerful version soon, it might come to bite them in the butt, because one of the big things that's been keeping the Switch moving is those third-party titles, and those are going to dry up real fast.
Yeah, I think just addressing kind of what I view as kind of a bigger problem than just not a bigger problem, but a core problem with their consoles lately is, innovative is true, right? There have been innovative things in Nintendo consoles. That's true. But a lot of the things that I think consumers, the average consumer, and maybe not the people hardcore into games, but the average consumer, they look at a console that Nintendo has made, like the Wii or the Wii U or the 3DS, and they say, wow, that's super cool. And developers who are trying to develop for Xbox, PlayStation, PC, and whatever Nintendo console is most popular right now looks at it and says, wow, that's a headache. I have to completely change everything about my game if I want it to monopolize on the reason lots of people bought this system in the first place. I have to figure out how to integrate motion controls for a Wii game if I want to port over some really popular PS3, PS4, Wii, PS2, PS3, or Xbox game. If I want to port any of those over to the Wii, I now have to integrate motion controls if I want to capitalize on, why people even bought this system in the first place. Wii U, I have to figure out how to capitalize on this second screen, and I have to change how my game plays because Xbox, PlayStation, and PC don't have a second screen by default. They don't have a second screen that you just hold in your hands. If I want to capitalize on the 3D, if I want to port over one of my more popular games in a smaller package on the 3DS, I have to figure out how to make my game work with that specific software that's making things 3D on the 3DS. I have to now make a big change that I didn't have to make for PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. And as a result, that's the reason that until the Switch came along, Nintendo didn't have very much third-party support. For like a decade, it was a pretty much barren wasteland when it came to AAA third-party titles. It was all first-party in-house, and as soon as they moved on from that console, that was it. And even then, Nintendo would make a lot of, shall we say, subpar games to monopolize on this thing that they sold their system for. Such as, I don't remember what year it was, but E3 when they showed off that Wii Band Simulator game, and they had and it didn't even work, but they decided to show it at E3, and everybody who saw it is like, this is stupid, and why would we want this? Just because a system can do something doesn't mean it should or is a good idea or that we want it to do that thing. And Nintendo has struggled to understand that a lot of the time throughout kind of its mid history. And I think the Switch was a good attempt to bring it back, but like you said, came with a lot of problems of its own.
Well, and I think that this brings up the point that Nintendo's kind of mode of operation, their big push tends to be innovation. And it's something that they've talked about in interviews, that they feel like if they're not pushing the medium forward in some way, they're not doing something new or different, that they're failing. Now, sometimes this is a great ideology because it forces you to look outside the box and see what you can do that can succeed. Sometimes it makes them blind to bad game design. Great example of this is Star Fox Zero. Star Fox Zero in of itself is not a bad game, but the controls make it nauseating and difficult to deal with. Once you get a handle on those controls, it's still just kind of a mediocre game, because the only thing that they really innovated on was the controls, but they innovated in such a way that made no sense. And that's something that they've done a number of times. Star Fox Zero is just kind of the best example. It's actually funny, Star Fox as a series tends to be Nintendo's kind of go-to to show off what a system can do. When they originally created the Star Fox series, they created it using 3D graphics. And the reason they did that was just so that they could show off that they could. That's the entire reason they created the first Star Fox, was to show we can create a pseudo 3D game world and run it on our system. There is no other 3D games on that system because it was incredibly difficult to achieve, didn't look great, and wasn't necessarily what people wanted. But Nintendo did it to show that they could. It's the same reason why they essentially remade it for the Nintendo 64, just to show off, hey, look at how nice the 3D graphics look now. And if you've played the original game versus the 64, they're very similar. And that's why. It's because they were, just kind of updating it to be, now you can see what real 3D looks like. And then they did the same thing with the other two Star Fox games, though unfortunately I can't remember exactly the specifics of what they were trying to push with them. But if you look into the history, they tend to release them for their systems to show a specific capability that system can do that nothing else can. And aside from Star Fox 64, hasn't really been very successful for them, which is, not great. And there's also, just because of how quote unquote innovative they've been trying to become, they don't generally create sequels to games in a rapid fashion. Now, this might be a pro or a con for you depending on how you look at it, because it's like, oh, they're not, just trying to drum up a new game as quickly as possible to, generate money. Isn't that great of them? Well, there's been plenty of games that have been created in a very short amount of time that have reused assets, that have been fantastic games, that have even been games that couldn't have existed otherwise. So in my opinion, creating rapid sequels is not necessarily a bad thing, but never creating a rapid sequel is a bad thing, because you're just stagnating your audience in, they want something and you're not giving it to them, because if you're not changing the entire premise, what's the point?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I think what goes along with that, or something I could kind of tack onto that I think is a great irony, is that Nintendo has obviously, don't get me wrong here, okay? I understand every company is trying to make money. That is literally what they're there for, is to make money, to employ people, and to make the people who own the company make a lot of money. But Nintendo seems to have shifted their focus from innovation, pushing the industry forward, and pleasing consumers, to doing whatever it takes to make money. A couple of examples of this. And then I'll get to why this is ironic. One, YouTube, right? They've changed their policy, but for quite a while, you had to become part of their specific partner program, in quotes, to really publish anything that had anything to do with Nintendo, using any of their characters, using any footage from their games, using any of their promotional material, which is dumb, because that's how you get more people to buy your game, is by people watching your game on YouTube from their favorite YouTubers. But B, is really scummy to look at a YouTuber who has perhaps spent 10, 20 hours recording a series all in advance, editing them all and releasing them on YouTube to make their living, and then turning around and saying, hey, no, that's ours, thanks, no more money for you. And not even just demonetized, but all your work gone. You have to take your video down. You cannot show that unless you specifically sign up with us. On top of that, if you get 3 copyright strikes, which is what Nintendo would do, your whole channel would get pulled down and just be gone. And then on top of that, if you do join the program, you have very specific requirements for the videos showing the things. And on top of all of that bullcrap you have to go through, or at least had to go through, they still took 30% of your earnings on any videos that fell into that category. So not only did you have to go through all of these things just to promote their products, but you had to pay them
to do it. That is
yes,
a dick move.
It was ridiculous. It was, and like obviously they got just hammered with backlash because it was horrible. Just like, honestly, it was inhumane to these content creators. And the second point that I want to talk about a little bit, and we can talk about this more in depth because I'm sure you'll have some thoughts that you want to share on it. But Amiibo, right? Amiibo are artificial moneymakers. Because if any of you have taken an economics class, you understand the concept of supply and demand, and you understand the concept of a monopoly, which is exactly what Nintendo is, because they're the only ones that have license to make their characters, their extremely, extremely popular characters, and make statues of them, and they artificially throttle their supply so that there is always significantly more demand for amiibos than specific amiibo editions exist. And so they jack up the price because they know that people are willing to pay that amount because they've artificially changed their supply.
Ooh, I want to talk about that just a little bit. So Nintendo generally sells their amiibos for $15. That price varies depending on certain editions and whatnot. And in spite of the throttling, they don't really change their prices. However, prices do increase due to scalpers. Now, to your point of Nintendo having a monopoly on this, you would wonder, if they can increase the price to reduce demand and still make tons of money, why aren't they the ones increasing the cost instead of scalpers doing it? The reason is because Nintendo doesn't want to lose money on Amiibo. So they make low production runs of their Amiibo and wait until it sells out to make more. And that process of events is leading to this scalpers market. Now, on top of that, I think Amiibos are garbage for two reasons. One, paid DLC in most instances, if you are locking content away, that is a bad thing. If you're giving additional content, that's a good thing. But if you know that the developers developed this before they released the game, but you can't have it unless you pay them additional money, okay, that's a scummy practice. If you've created the game and then go on to create additional content, and you're like, hey, now that we've made more content, if you want access to it, you need to pay us, that makes sense. That's like making a sequel or, a side story or whatever. That's perfectly acceptable. But if the product exists, but the only way to unlock it is by paying additional money, that is garbage. And that is exactly, not just exactly, that is explicitly what Amiibo is, because you cannot unlock something using Amiibo unless it already exists in the game.
Let's talk about the worst, in my opinion, culprit of this.
Wait. One more thing before we move on. On top of that being scummy, the fact that it is a physical thing means that not only do you have to pay additional money to unlock something that is already in the game, but it's something that they can run out of, and it's something that you have to wait to receive. So it is the worst practice of additional money grubbing I have seen, and I am just completely surprised that no one seems to have issues with this in the broader gaming culture. I have not seen any videos decrying, the specific practice of Amiibos locking content or anything like that. Everyone who sees a new Amiibo seems to be jumping on the bandwagon of, oh, it looks so cool and I can't wait and I hope I can get it. And it's like, guys, this is crap. Like,
yeah. I see those kinds of posts on Reddit, where I'm on like the Nintendo subreddit and I see a picture that like finally got it, and they have like, a little Majora's Mask amiibo and like a Ganondorf amiibo, and in the comments it was like, how much did you get that for? And it's like, oh, $80 each, but totally worth it. But I think the biggest culprit of using of this, or the biggest indicator, right, of how scummy amiibos can be, is Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival. Now picture this. Picture Mario Party without any minigames and without any winners or losers, or really any gameplay whatsoever. And now imagine Mario Party taking away everything that makes it Mario Party other than walking around in a circle, and add in the fact that to play as any of the characters you like, you have to buy a little statue of them in real life. You have to buy the game to use your amiibos, but you need amiibos to play the game that isn't even a game. Like, there's nothing really gamified about this walking in a circle story simulator.
It's essentially Nintendo's first foray into true mobile gaming of, you know, you get something for free, quote unquote, and then you pay to really play it the way you want to. Except Amiibo Festival is worse because you have to pay to get the game, then you have to pay to play the game. Now, I want to add to this whole dumping on Amiibo because, I mean, even more so than I already have, specifically because I personally really enjoy a lot of Nintendo's characters, and I also really enjoy buying statues of things. If you ever see my house, it is full of statues. I mean, full of statues. So many statues, I don't have space to put more statues, but I have more statues, and I am buying more statues. I like statues. I have not bought a single amiibo because I think the practice of amiibo is so garbage that it is not worth my time. And let me tell you, I have almost bought amiibos a number of times because they are very well produced, but I just can't go through with it because they're such a scummy practice that I just cannot let myself do it.
Yeah, and to bring this full circle to what I was talking about, the irony is that Nintendo does these things. They throttle YouTubers and squeeze them dry. They artificially they do the amiibo stuff that we just covered. That's garbage. If they wanted to make more money, they could just make more games with the same engine. They pushed Majora's Mask out a year after Ocarina of Time. I recognize games are different now, but they could easily make 2, 3, even 4 more sequels to Breath of the Wild using that same engine if they did it well, if they just changed the story, changed the location a little bit. Making an engine is the longest part of the game, and they already have a massively successful first one to work off of. They could have made a sequel to Twilight Princess. They could have made a sequel to Wind Waker. They did. They could have made a sequel on the GameCube for Wind Waker. They could have made a sequel to... They could make a sequel to Mario Odyssey. Maybe they will. They haven't said anything about it yet. But they could. But they don't. They don't make sequels to their massively successful properties to make more money because, I guess, they don't want to feel like they're rehashing their ideas, and they want to be innovative. Okay, so that's great. So instead, they turn to amiibos and YouTube policies and taking down the virtual console and putting up a subscription service that is not very expansive, all to get more money that they could be making in other ways that would please their consumers a lot more.
Well, and not only that, but they have pushed forward on a number of their mobile game platforms. You got Mario Kart Tour, Dr. Mario World, Super Mario Run. All of these games, or Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, a lot of these games are free, but to really play them, you have to pay a lot of money. And these are not high-quality games. These are very much low-quality, knockoff quality games that you have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to quote unquote enjoy. If you've never listened to our podcast before, neither of us enjoy mobile gaming. Just the fact that it is what it is kind of turns us off. But on top of that, the intense monetization and, you know, unfriendly user experience just adds to that. And Nintendo is supposed to be, you know, this golden example of what to do as a game company, and yet they have produced these awful game titles that pander to the lowest common denominator. And again, if you like these games, I have nothing against you. I don't think you're a bad person, and I don't think that you're less of a gamer. But these tend to pander to people that are not really in the gaming sphere and are more casually just trying to waste their time on something familiar. And it doesn't really let you do that unless you pay exorbitant amounts of money. And to put that in perspective, Mario Kart Tour, in its first month of its release, made close to $40 million. A free game made $40 million in a month. And it's barely a game. Like, I don't know if you've ever played it, but it turns out that the majority of the things that they said you could do in the game are lies. It is a dumbed down, barely usable, you know, kart racer that will use some of your friends' names, but you won't actually play against them. It's all NPCs. Now, they may have changed this. I never saw them actually changing it. I think I saw that they talked about changing it, but they never did. So they lied to consumers. They created a subpar product, but because the characters in it are so beloved, people eat it up and do not decry Nintendo's bullcrap. On top of this, there is something that Nintendo has been kind of sort of dinged on, which is the quality of their physical Switch Joy-Cons. They created these Joy-Con controllers, and to ensure that they were thin enough, they used a specific type of analog controller that is now known to fail over time. It is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And the reason for this is it has to do with the mechanics of the analog controller. If you ever look into how analog controllers function, you'll see that they generally are relatively bulky to allow for it to be very robust. If you look inside of a PlayStation 4 controller or an Xbox controller or any large controller like that, you'll see that the actual pieces that you're moving are made of metal. In the Nintendo Switch, there is a metal piece that scrapes across a non-metal piece to elicit the voltage. And because of that, over time, and the more you play your Switch, the faster this happens, that membrane that is not made of metal gets torn. And so there's nothing you can do to fix it other than physically replacing that material, which Nintendo is now doing for free, but they have yet to remedy the cause of the issue. They have yet to talk with the manufacturers and say, you need to change this. And I imagine it's because that is the only analog stick that would fit into the system. They'd have to redesign the system to allow for it to work. But to look at Nintendo and say, oh, they're consumer friendly and they're consumer focused, and ignore this massive debacle that they have no intention of remedying seems a bit tone deaf to me.
Yeah, I think definitely. I have been the colloquial name for this is Joy-Con drift, because it just causes kind of a short in your controller that makes it so your character will move one way or the other, even when you're not even touching the controller. And I've had that in Zelda, where I had Link just run off a cliff, which is, you know, as you might imagine, pretty annoying. But so yeah, that's definitely something that's ridiculous, that it hasn't even been, you know, there hasn't even been some adjustment made to try to fix the problem. But the last thing I want to say before we kind of maybe talk about the trend that we see and kind of our thoughts about perhaps the future. The last thing that I think Nintendo really has dropped the ball on, and they do get flack for it, but not as much as I feel like they should, is their online service. Because Nintendo, there's two kinds of online services that game companies can offer. There's peer-to-peer, which means that your internet connection is connecting through kind of a proxy to somebody else's internet connection. And the speed of your game, like in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the ability for you to fight that other person and not have the game stutter and have serious network problems is dependent on both of your internets being good enough and fast enough to run this online connection. Or you can have, I don't know what it's called, but it's not peer-to-peer. I'll just say peer-to-server for ease of me not looking it up. It's where both of the people playing in an online match, again, like in Super Smash Bros., connect to an external server that is running the match, that is generally owned by Nintendo or a third-party company that they've contracted the service out to. And that way, you don't have to worry about the other person's internet connection or your own, or the other person's internet connection. All you have to worry about is your own internet connection being fast enough to connect to that server. So if you're having latency and connection problems, it's purely your fault. Now that method of both players connecting to an external server has become the hallmark of good online play with Sony and Xbox. And both of them require you nowadays to pay for that service. And some games let you connect to that, like the developers' external servers, which a lot of times are not necessarily as good as the developers. Nintendo, on the other hand, still uses peer-to-peer connection, which is just dumb. It's just stupid. Their online services have been awful since the days of the Wii U, possibly even the Wii. I don't know if the Wii had a lot of online capabilities.
It did. Well, I mean,
did.
It had online capabilities, but it was just as terrible as it is today, and it was terrible then. So the fact that it hasn't improved, even though it's been over a decade, is very telling. And on top of that, like you said, you have to pay for it now. What are you paying for? You're not paying for anything other than the privilege of being able to go online, something you already pay for to get your internet service, but now you pay them to let you use the internet that you already have to talk to someone else over their system, because they haven't set up any servers dedicated to helping with that or doing any kind of, any kind of safety checks. The internet that you get through their systems is still abysmal, even though now you're paying for it. So all those people that say, I'm on a PC and I get to play online for free, well, yeah, in Nintendo's case, that's true. You're not getting anything out of that service that you couldn't get on PC for free. Other companies, Sony and Microsoft, they actually do, you pay for something that you couldn't necessarily get through your PC. You don't necessarily need it through PC, but you're paying for something that they're doing for you. Nintendo, that is not the case. They're trying to justify it with their whole virtual console subscription thingy, but I mean, how many people are really using that? And this is coming from someone who is paying for it. I pay $8 every 3 months to get their online service, to get those virtual console things, just so that I can have them, just so that I have, the capability to do whatever I want. But I'm not really paying for anything because they're not giving me anything that I don't already have.
Yeah, it's just Nintendo has been notoriously bad for like over a decade, and they haven't fixed it, and it's just baffling because there are so many people that pay for it, and I guess that's the problem, right? People are willing to pay for it even when it hasn't been fixed. So of course I'm not going to change it. But that doesn't make it any less scummy. That doesn't make it any less ridiculous that you can go onto a PlayStation and Xbox and play in, as long as your internet is up to snuff, you can play really, really, really smooth online multiplayer with like 40 other people. And you try to play a one-on-one match in Smash Bros. Ultimate, and in a lot of cases, it's completely unplayable, and you just get, you either lose for no good reason, or the other person just disconnects, and, either way, it's not about winning or losing, it's about having a good experience. And if you're getting kicked out of games all the time, and even when you're in a game, it's running like crap, that's terrible. That's just really bad, especially for a game like Super Smash Bros., who is built on the premise and could live by online multiplayer if it was just good or passable even.
Yeah, and so with that, I think we want to move into kind of, that's all the history. That's everything we know about Nintendo so far. Well, obviously not everything. We can't go over everything, in the amount of time that we have, and we don't really want to get into all the super nitty-gritty details, but it's a pretty good overview of what Nintendo has been doing, where they're at right now. Now we want to talk a little bit about where we feel they are headed. This is, absolutely speculative speaking, but based on Nintendo's history and based on the decisions that they're doing right now and what they have very recently released, they're at least semi-educated guesses. The first thing that I want to say is that in terms of games, core franchises, I think Nintendo is still on the up and up. Obviously, Super Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild were both amazing, fantastic games. The what's that game called? The Switch Fit, Fitbit, whatever that new motion controlled game is, I think is great. It gets people active. It's very interesting. It does tie into the whole not making enough because they don't want to lose money, so they underproduce rather than overproduce. But the game itself is solid. The minds behind some of those franchises are amazing, and I hope that they continue to churn out quality products, and I hope that they continue to enhance these beloved franchises. On pretty much every other front, I think they're headed towards a decline. And I think that especially this next year, things are not going to go very well for them. To give you guys a little bit of perspective on Switch sales versus their competitors, which is obviously Sony and Microsoft, the PlayStation 4 outsold the Nintendo Switch the year the Nintendo Switch came out. The Nintendo Switch sold like hotcakes, and then PlayStation 4 had been out for years. Yet, still, the PlayStation 4 outsold the Nintendo Switch. Now, there's no way that the PlayStation 4 outsold the Switch over the next couple of years, because the Switch was new, kept coming out with new kind of gangbuster types of games, and everyone knew that the PlayStation 4 was kind of diminishing and we were going to get the next generation. But the fact that this old system outsold the Switch is telling that the market isn't quite as excited as some people think for the Switch. The capabilities of the Switch and the fact that you can take it on the go are not quite as motivating as just having high quality games. Because the PlayStation 4 over the past couple of years has had a massive high budget console moving game that you can only get on the PlayStation 4 like every year for the past couple of years. There was Horizon Zero Dawn, there was God of War, there was Spider-Man, there's The Last of Us 2 Part 2 this year, which, whether people love it or hate it, sold more copies in its first month, in this first week, than any other PlayStation 4 exclusive to date.
Which is saying something, because people are really excited for God of War and Spider-Man. Like, that's really saying something. That's really impressive.
Right. So it's games that sell a system. And while Nintendo does have some fantastic games, they really only have a couple that are console movers. Super Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, absolutely console movers. All of the other games that have come out on it, correct me if I'm wrong, but not really. It's, there's people that will buy the console for some of the other games, but not wide appealing.
Yeah, I think probably the only other one that probably maybe matches them is probably Smash Bros. Animal Crossing maybe moved a couple, but it's such a niche title comparatively that I doubt it really reaches those levels.
I take it back. Animal Crossing probably is a console seller. Animal Crossing appeals to a lot of people that I would say are non-traditional gamers. There's a big demographic of people that enjoy Animal Crossing that don't enjoy other kind of mainstream titles. So at least for that fact, it's likely to be a robust console mover. But all that being said, I think that Nintendo is going to be going into a decline because it's not going to be able to compete. And they themselves say they are not competing with Sony or Microsoft. They're trying to keep their niche market their own. And whether or not that will be successful remains to be seen. Personally, I really, really hope that they stop making consoles. So much. I really hope they stop making consoles. Because imagine the quality of games that they could produce on a console 2 to 3 times more powerful. And I don't have specific specs on this pulled up, but the current comparison is probably at least twice as powerful as the Switch. And the next generation is just going to be that much more powerful. But you imagine what Nintendo can do when they no longer have to deal with all these finicky extra peripheral bullcrap they throw into their consoles. They've got so much more power, and because they're no longer investing time, money, and effort into dealing with consoles and marketing for consoles and hardware and all this stuff, they can focus just on what they're good at, which is making video games. Now, if they still want to, try to do something that's interesting, they can still produce, some one-off peripherals, just like they did with the new Ring Fit Adventure. That's what it's called, right? That you can still do the Labo thing, the Ring Fit Adventure, the Wii Balance Board, all that stuff. You can create these peripherals for the PlayStation, for the Xbox. But now, suddenly, people don't have to buy your underpowered system to get into your games. They don't have to, there's just so many things that they no longer have to worry about. And I think it would be the best for the consumer and possibly for Nintendo to stop trying to create and sell consoles. And that's because A, I hate their consoles. B, their consoles have never sold as well as other consoles, except for the Wii, which sold amazingly, but still not the highest selling console ever. And 3, it would allow for a lot more... Wait, what was I saying? Oh, and 3, consoles are almost always sold at a loss to encourage people to buy them. So every time you buy a system, you are buying it at cost or lower. So if Nintendo stopped trying to get into the console market, they would not only have a broader range of people that they could sell to, but they're not wasting money on trying to sell the console anyway. And, I'm sure that there's a lot of business development behind why people are interested in selling consoles. And why it may be fiscally responsible for them to do that. But from what I can tell and from what I have seen, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to just stop fighting against the flow, give up on the consoles, and just put their games where the most number of people can enjoy them.
Yeah, there's kind of an interesting for anybody that doesn't know, I'm in college right now. I'm studying international relations, and I'm graduating this year. So I have some insight into what I'm talking about here. But in the world, right, there is a very compelling, strong, and widely believed theory that two major powers balancing each other out is significantly more stable, and to extend this metaphor to gaming, does a lot more for people and is a lot better and kind of utilitarian in that consumers get a lot more benefit when there's two major powers than if there's only one or if there's three or more. And I think that's something that we've seen ever since the advent of Microsoft, PlayStation, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo kind of competing, is that eventually it was a tug of war, and eventually I think a third party just kind of needs to concede and recognize when they need to join forces with one, both, or just kind of stay, or like join forces with one or kind of stay neutral and not serve, and just kind of serve both of them. And I think that's kind of what we're coming into, like you said, is like, I think eventually Nintendo needs to take a step back from the things that they're doing, because I find it funny that you say that not that you say, that they have said that they want to appeal to their niche market, because frankly, if we look at the new Pokemon Sword and Shield, not well liked because it looked like a scaled up handheld game and they got rid of half the Pokédex or something like that. And the new Pokemon MOBA, not at all what their consumers wanted. Like, at all.
At least their main consumer base. Pokemon is such a globally recognized franchise that they can make literally anything with Pokemon and it will sell millions, which is unfortunate. But the fact that they showed off this demo and were promoting it to their core audience, and this goes back to something we've said previously about how video games are generally marketed. But during these events, especially this summer, the people who are watching are the people who are invested in your core franchises, are generally the people who have your systems or are looking to get them. So when someone has your system or is looking to get your system, and then you say, hey, we're making this for a phone, and it's not anything like anything we've made before, and it's going to be quote unquote free, like, people who are interested in core video games are going to be like, what the hell is this? Like, why do you think I would want this, let alone care about it? Like, no.
Yeah, and when you look at, if Nintendo were to back off from the console wars, right, and just say, okay, all of our games that we made, we're gonna work on, for the Switch, we're gonna work on porting all of the Switch titles to PS4 and Xbox, and we're not making any more games only for the Switch. We'll continue Switch compatibility as long as it's relevant, but we're going to make sure all of our games work on the Xbox and the PlayStation. And as soon as this console is no longer able to run games that the PlayStation and the Xbox can, we're not making any more consoles. We're just making games for the PlayStation and the Xbox. Suddenly, all those games that weren't selling systems before are going to be sold. If somebody doesn't have the system, they're not going to buy the game. But if you make a game that isn't going to move a system, and consumers have already bought a PS4 or a PS5 or a Series X, they might look at that game and say, well, it's only $30. It's not like I have to drop $350 on a new console to play it. Sure, I'll give it a shot. and they might actually buy the game. Like you said, Nintendo has very few console selling games. Their console selling games sell consoles, and people who are committed to Nintendo will buy consoles, but their games, by and large, will sell much better if they're just available cross-platform.
Yeah, especially if they decided to put things on PC, which, you know, in a perfect world, Nintendo would stop trying to sell systems and they would just put their games on all available systems, and we'd all be happy. With that, talking about how I think that in general they're kind of negative, I just want to finish up with the last couple of niggling little things, which is I hate Nintendo. Okay? I hate Nintendo. I hate Nintendo with a burning passion. I love some of Nintendo's games, but Nintendo as a company I think is super scummy, and I don't think they're called out enough for it. First of all, there's all the things that we've, put forward before this, but in addition to those things that I dislike, there's also the fact that Nintendo acts like they're like Disney, where they're the only people who are creating content friendly for children, and that's just not true. And one thing that I really don't like that they do is the price of their products almost never goes down. You take a look at Sony or Microsoft, and they both have this system in place where a couple of years after a game has come out, it will drastically drop in price. And it will drop in price to be like $20 instead of $60. Sometimes that happens more quickly than others, but in general, if you don't have the money to pay for $60 games, you know that you will eventually be able to get the game at $20 or less a couple of years down the line. And I think that's fantastic, because I don't think that video games should be an elitist's hobby. I think they should be available to everyone. I think people should make money off of it, so I don't have a problem with it being expensive to begin with. But as time moves on, games should decrease in value. Nintendo does not do this. Every Nintendo game sits at $60, and except for sales, it stays at $60. And that's bullcrap. And it makes it very difficult to get Nintendo games. Nintendo is currently getting away with this because people for some reason think that Nintendo games are of a higher caliber than any other game developer, and it's not. They are competent, they are good at what they do, but they're not better than everyone else. Okay, there's nothing that makes Nintendo special. Nintendo has solid IP and has a very specific aesthetic that they tend to put into their games. And in a lot of cases, they have a lot of polish in their games, but they're not the only company that does that. And so they shouldn't be able to get away with keeping their prices so inflated when they should be following the market. And then, of course, there's just all sorts of other things, like they take credit for dozens of games, claiming that they produce it themselves, or just saying that it's from Nintendo when a completely different company built it. And it's still, it's a Nintendo franchise. Well, when's the last time Nintendo actually did anything with it? Star Fox is a great example of this. I think Star Fox 64 is the last Star Fox game that Nintendo actually created. Everything else has been, had some insight from Nintendo, but it was a different company that made it. That should be the company that takes credit for it. The entire Metroid series, except for Metroid or Super Metroid, everything after Super Metroid has been made by a different company.
Yeah,
different companies.
I think like you're PlayStation 4 exclusives are obviously, Sony has made deals with developers, but you would never say that Spider-Man is a Sony game, right? It's an Insomniac game. And from that, the reason this matters, if anybody's like, okay, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters to the developer, Because if you look at a game that has a Nintendo seal of approval on it and no really mention of the other developer, you're going to think, oh, wow, that Nintendo game looks great. Nintendo makes great games. And then if that developer that made that game that you thought was great makes another game down the line, you might look at that game and be like, who the heck is that? Like, what is that? Like, nobody, that's a no-name developer. Like, what have they even made? Whereas if you look at Sony and PS4 exclusives, okay, Spider-Man made by Insomniac. Great. Next time Insomniac comes out with a game, everybody's going to be associating that developer name with Spider-Man. And they're going to think, wow, that game was awesome. I can't wait to see what else Insomniac puts out. And that's, just if anybody's wondering, that's my take on why it's a pretty scummy practice, because you're taking, plagiarism isn't cool. It's never cool to take credit for a project that nobody in your company even worked on. You licensed it out to somebody else and they made it, and they should get to, share in the glory of that.
Well, and I think it goes back to when we first started talking about their scummy YouTube practices. They're so tight-fisted on their IP that if someone is promoting their IP by putting up gameplay or reviews or whatever, they're like, no, you can't do that. But if someone is using their IP, it's like, that's our game, not yours. Okay, you don't tell people, yeah, you can be in the credits, but that's a Nintendo game, not a Retro Studios game, not a HAL Productions game. It's a Nintendo game. And, on top of that, they don't do the same thing that Sony does in terms of IP. Sony and Microsoft, when they have third-party studios, they give them tons of money and generally low oversight to produce amazing games, right? These are games that could not exist otherwise because the cost of labor is not justified by future sales. Now, that's not to say that future sales won't cover the cost. It's just to say that the money that you have as a company is not necessarily going to get you through 6 years of high-budget game development. But Sony footing the bill or Microsoft footing the bill will. And that allows games that could not exist otherwise. So Sony and Microsoft less so, but it seems like they're starting to pick up on how important this is, are giving game properties or giving the ability of game development studios. They're saying, we trust you. Here's a check for tons and tons of money. Tell us how much time you need. And every now and again, we're going to check in to make sure that, you're producing something worthwhile. But that's it. And that's why some of Sony's first-party titles have been not quite as good as others, and it's because Sony is not telling them exactly what to do. Nintendo, on the other hand, lets people develop their IP, but is not footing the bill for it. So essentially, they have this tight hold over their IPs and are like, if you want to develop this, we have direct oversight. We're going to tell you what you can and can't do. And, obviously they're going to get money out of it, but Nintendo has not been giving people the same kind of funding that other major publishing studios have to be able to create these games. And you can see that in the quality of some of these third-party titles. When Metroid Other M came out, the story was terrible. And it's obvious that the oversight they had was on the gameplay and not the story. But it's also obvious that the development studio didn't have enough time to put the polish on the story that they wanted, because there's massive gaping plot holes that are just in it. And the same thing with what's it? It's just, I just think that Nintendo as a company is seen as something that's fantastic and can do no wrong, and it's just this brilliant beacon of light in the scummy world of game development, and they are just as bad, if not worse, than so many others. I have spoken highly in this of Sony and Microsoft, but that is not to say that they're blameless or faultless either. There's plenty of things they do that could be improved, should be improved. But today we're focusing on Nintendo because Nintendo tends to get away with it. Other companies don't.
So, throughout this whole reality check regarding Nintendo, and especially now, you might be saying, okay, I didn't necessarily know all these things, or maybe you did already know all of these things. But, Westin, Jordan, what am I supposed to do about it? What do we do about it? Now I can't speak for Jordan, but I'm not saying go boycott Nintendo. But, when it comes down to it, if you want Nintendo to change their online, to stop the amiibo practices, to stop taking credit for what other studios do, and to treat other studios more respectfully, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but money speaks. If you don't buy the products and you don't buy the microtransactions in Mario Kart World Tour, they're not going to keep doing it. The only reason these things get proliferated is because people keep buying it. And that's why education about these things, this is why Nintendo and their games should receive more criticism, is so that people can recognize and get past those rose-tinted glasses of the Nintendo, the N64, and the GameCube, and even into the Wii, to notice all the, the things that have crept in that are continually supported because people refuse to boycott them and to speak out against them and to say, no, I'm not going to buy your stupid online service. No, you need to make it better before I'm going to pay you for that. No, I'm not going to buy your amiibos to put on this, to be able to even play this other game that I still had to buy. No, I'm not going to buy your amiibos to unlock content that should have been in the base game. I'm not going to buy those things because I don't want to support that terrible, terrible business practice. At the end of the day, I think that's why education is so important and why these things need to be talked about so much.
I think from my perspective, I will say that generally boycotting works if you can get enough people to do it. But in the gaming sphere, that's never going to happen. So obviously, I don't buy Amiibo, and there's a lot of other things from Nintendo I don't buy because I don't support the practice. Has that impacted Nintendo? Probably not, because one person doesn't make that much of a difference. 1,000 people don't really make that much of a difference. But choosing for yourself not to buy into something is always a good thing and will never be a negative. However, I think the more important thing is to change the discussion surrounding Nintendo. When you see things online, when you're talking with people, day to day, and something about Nintendo comes up, don't let them get away with saying or doing things that aren't okay, right? When you talk about Nintendo's games, or if you're talking about how much you love the Metroid franchise, talk about the people who actually made it, not Nintendo. The Metroid Prime series, that's not a Nintendo series. That's a Retro Studio series. And Retro Studio did amazing with it. What did Nintendo do with it? Nintendo hasn't produced a Metroid game for themselves in who knows how long. Now, if there's anything that you guys disagree with what we said, or you want to commiserate with us in our dislike of Nintendo, or even more so, if you have some information that we may have missed or misrepresented, please let us know about it, because we're not looking to seem like we're the smartest people in the room. We're looking to start a conversation. And if at any point we say something that's just, wrong or that you can add to, we want to hear about it so that the next time we can fix that. And if you do have anything like that, questions, comments, concerns, send them to reflectionsongaming@gmail.com. And, hopefully next time we can talk about that stuff too.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to, we're just people. We're just people doing a passion project, talking about things we are passionate about. But obviously, we're not, we're not industry experts beyond just, mostly experience. But if you did, if you enjoyed this podcast and you've enjoyed what we've talked about, or have even just thought it was interesting, please not only contact us, but help other people hear it too. And leave a rating, leave a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. It really, really helps us get out to more people. And we'd love to expand our community a little bit and get more people's thoughts, because the best conversations are made up of a lot more than just two voices.
A lot more than just two voices. With that, I think I just want to say thanks for listening, especially if you made it this far. Hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you're excited for the next episode.
Bye.